So as you know, this is part of the week-long Chinese Culture Festival organized by the Confucius Institute of the University of Michigan. And as part of this festival, we have a couple of events surrounding our visiting guest artists from Beijing. We're very excited to have them here. And today is the first event, so it's mainly a lecture to introduce the piece and provide some sort of academic framing to think about the piece and appreciate it. So the performance itself is happening on Saturday night at 7 p.m. And for those of you who are interested, there's also a workshop happening that's free and open to the public at 12 p.m. tomorrow. It goes from 12 to 2, and it's in the dance department building. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest artist. So 你们可以过来，我给你们介绍一下。Gu Jiani grew up in southern China, and she was professionally trained in ballet and Chinese classical dance. However, dissatisfied with the monotony of conventional training, she embarked on a path of meditative self-discovery, which led to a unique fusion of balletic cleanliness and the subtle delicacy of Chinese classical dance, which has become a hallmark of her style. She is particularly interested in the interaction between internal psychological space and external environmental spaces. This led her to set up N Space Body Project, which creates residencies to place the soft body in different hard constructed spaces. These investigate how the presence of the body and the space in which it is situated affect each other, and how the distribution of bodily energy in different spaces impacts the audience's visual and psycho-emotional reactions. She has collaborated with a number of international artists from Germany, in China as well, and she's also a painter. She sees that visual medium as a symbiotic in designing the spatial relations of her choreography. Her cross-disciplinary projects include working for a furniture brand commercial in 2014, which won an award in Great Britain for the best commercial short film. She also was a movement coach for a Chinese opera musical, and she works with the Chinese independent musician Ding He on a music video. She also has a long-term collaboration and serves as a choreography instructor for a Chinese pop star, Tan Weiwei. In 2011, she won the Best Young Choreographer Award, and in 2013, the Bronze Medal for Choreography in the annual Beijing International Ballet and Choreography Competition. Her international tours and residencies include projects in Italy and Houston, Texas, as well as this performance at the University of Michigan, and the one after this will take place in Melbourne. So let's welcome Gu Jiani. She's not only the choreographer of the piece that you'll see on Saturday, but also one of the two performers. So the next person I'll introduce is Li Nan. Li Nan graduated in 1989 from the Chinese Classical Dance Department of the Guangdong Provincial Dancing School, one of the top national dance schools in China. She further studied at the Beijing Dance Academy in 1996 to 2002, and she won the Bronze Prize in 1998 and the Gold Prize in 1999 in the National Taolibei Dance Competition, the most influential award in mainstream dance in China. She joined the China National Opera and Dance Ensemble after graduation, but since then has been working as a freelance dancer with various contemporary dance choreographers and companies in China, Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain for the past 10 years. And since 2012, she has been working closely with Gu Jiani on several successful duets, as well as dance videos. Since 2013, they have been leading the site-specific performance project and space physical project. So let's welcome Li Nan. And last but not least, we have our wonderful lighting designer, who you'll see has a specific role to play in the performance, although you can't see her on stage, and that's Aping. After graduating in 2002, but yeah, go ahead. So after graduating in 2002 from the Communications University of China with her BA in sound recording engineering, Aping has worked for the China Central Television Station as a sound recorder from 2007 to 2011. She then started to travel and learn yoga, belly dance, contemporary dance, ballet, Dunham technique, Afro-Brazilian, modern jazz, blues, and traditional Indian dance in Germany, the US, and India, etc. While working as a freelance professional sound recorder, she has also performed as a dancer in the 19th Orient Festival Europa in Germany, the Tribal Fest 12, the Year of the Unicorn in San Francisco, and Style Paper Tiger Theater Company, or theater studio in Beijing, China. She also worked with the Ulan Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, among other projects. So let's welcome Aki. So you'll have a chance to talk with them a bit after the talk today. Also, like I said, there's a workshop tomorrow, and there'll also be a post-show discussion with the artists on Saturday evening that will be completely bilingual. Unfortunately, today's talk, because we don't want to have it extend for too long, we're not going to have interpretation. However, I've discussed the paper with them, so they know some of the themes that I'll be talking about for the talk today. But we won't have an actual Q&A with them because they're not fluent in English. So, yeah. Okay, so thank you, everyone. So I want to just briefly introduce this paper. It's part of a new ethnology that's actually being edited by one of the faculty here at the University of Michigan, Claire Croft. And the title of the ethnology is Meanings and Makings of Queer Dance. It's under contract with Oxford University Press and planned to be published sometime either next year or the following year. So even though Claire's not here today, she's giving a talk somewhere else, I wanted to thank her for embracing this project as part of that anthology, and also for inviting me to write about the piece. An actual recording of the work will be included in the anthology, and we hope that it will serve as a teaching resource for faculty who teach in dance studies, queer studies, and gender studies. I'd also like to thank Allison Friedman. Where's Allison? Can you raise your hand and stand up? Yeah. So Allison is the founder and director of Ping Pong Productions, which is the presenter who actually introduced us to Gu Jiani and the work that will be presented this week. And I just want to emphasize how important it is to have these intercultural presenters, such as Ping Pong Productions, because they do so much work behind the scenes and really make it possible for young choreographers in China to show their work internationally. And Allison has been tremendous in supporting young talent in China in that way for many years, so I want her to be recognized for that. And finally, this project could not have been possible without generous funding from a number of institutions. This is the Ping Pong website. So among the funding sponsors for this project, you can see them all listed above, but a special link should go to the Confucius Institute and Joseph Lam specifically. He came to me last January, I think, with a very specific request. We want cutting-edge, avant-garde dance piece of the highlight for our Chinese dance festival. And so it was because of him that we went out and looked for this great work. So today's talk, I prepared about a 35-minute talk, and then I'll show a couple little clips, and we can have a discussion afterwards if you're interested. Oh, lastly, the writing was funded by another fellowship there. So if you haven't seen it already, I'm just going to start with this brief introduction to the piece. So I mentioned that Aping is there, but you can't see her. She's doing the live projection, so all the shadows that you see on the stage are being created by her movements using the projector. So despite the fact that one of China's most prominent contemporary choreographers is a publicly transsexual woman, and that indigenous theater in China has a long and well-known history of homoerotic spectatorship and patronage, the idea of queer dance, or public reflection on queer identities and experiences more generally, is almost non-existent in Chinese professional dance circles. Out queer choreographers are few and far between in major domestic dance festivals in China, as are dance productions or academic works that explicitly draw attention to non-normative genders and sexualities through dance. For women, this is even more pronounced than for men, due to a more circumscribed set of possibilities of what constitutes normal and appropriate for women's performed subjectivities and dancing bodies. The 55-minute contemporary dance duet, Right and Left, 右一左一, by Beijing-based female choreographer Gu Jiani, danced by Gu and Li Nan, with projections by media artist Aping, presents an important and unusual departure from this larger trend. When approached for inclusion in this anthology, Gu said that she herself does not consider Right and Left a work of queer dance. Thus, the following reading represents my interpretation of the work and not Gu's intention in creating it necessarily. For me, the exploration of human relationships and embodiments enacted in the piece challenges normative conceptions of women, feminine gender, and female sexuality as typically presented in dance works by Chinese choreographers in China. This includes contemporary dance works as well as works of modern Chinese ethnic, folk, and classical dance. In my view, the term queer feminism best describes this intervention because it engages a complex nexus of social norms that engender women's movement in dance in China, including heteronormativity, patriarchy, and gendered constructs of ethno-national identity. In this essay, I focus primarily on choreography, the ways in which bodies move on their own in relation to one another and in relation to theater space and stage properties. Through this analysis of choreography, I examine two areas in which Right and Left draws attention to, and in some cases successfully disrupts, typical portrayals of women in past works by Chinese choreographers. So first, through a comparison with the highly acclaimed contemporary dance piece Thunder and Rain, 雷和雨, by Beijing-based female choreographer Wang Mei, I argue that Right and Left challenges a common pattern in which female subjectivity and relationships between women are depicted as a product of women's unequal, even abusive heterosexual relationships with men. I argue that Right and Left challenges these portrayals by exploring alternative modes of female subjectivity produced through relationships between women, including potentially homoerotic ones, and by drawing attention to the violence against women perpetuated through works such as Thunder and Rain. Second, through an analysis of the presence and absence of culturally marked movement vocabulary in Right and Left, I examine Gu's choreographic choices around movement form in relation to her prior training in Chinese classical dance. Proposing the phrase queer Tai Chi remix to describe Gu's use of Chinese classical dance movement in this work, I suggest that while expanding the space for queer female subjectivity within ethno-national politics, Gu nevertheless avoids the issue of gender normativity as it relates to technique conventions and ethno-national identity in Chinese dance. Apart from choreography, choices in costuming, hair, sound, lighting, and stage design also contribute to the queer feminism of Gu Jiani's Right and Left. While I will not address all of these elements here, two details should be mentioned as they are important to the development of the choreographic meanings discussed below. Right and Left takes place in a white stage space with one rectangular table and two stools. This choice is significant in relation to the history of Chinese theater, since a table and 2 chairs comprise the traditional stage set for Peking opera and other forms of indigenous operatic theater in China. Here, the use of the table and stools places the dancers and their activities within a social frame, identifying them as dramatic figures rather than abstract bodies in space. In terms of costuming, it is also significant that the 2 female performers wear nearly identical costumes, long-sleeve knit shirts and gray leggings, yet have different hairstyles. One of the dancers wears her hair in a short cut that would be recognized as boyish to Chinese audiences. In contrast, the other dancer wears her hair in bangs and a medium-length braid, a conventionally feminine hairstyle common for young women in Chinese dance works. This difference in hairstyle sets up a situation in which one dancer can be read as gender conforming and the other as gender non-conforming, or the 2 together as a butch femme or TP couple. To avoid imposing a single interpretation on this simple hairstyle choice, while also marking the important differences it connotes at certain places in the choreography, I use the shorthand short hair and braid at times to refer to the 2 performers. In my experience, young women living in contemporary China face significant pressure to conform to the intersecting social expectations of heterosexuality, patriarchy, and gender normativity. Pressures that are reflected in the predominant modes of representing women in dance works by Chinese choreographers. By drawing attention to these practices and providing some alternatives to them, Gu Jiani's Right and Left makes an important contribution to a new field of queer feminist dance in China. So Wang Mei is a prolific choreographer and professor in the Department of Choreography at the Beijing Dance Academy, and one of the leading figures in 21st century Chinese contemporary dance. Wang began her career as a performer and later a choreographer of Chinese ethnic folk and classical dance. Then, in the late 80s, she was part of the inaugural group of students in an experimental modern dance program led by Yang Mei at the Guangdong Dance Academy, what led to the formation of the Guangdong Modern Dance Company. Since 1990, Wang has taught modern dance and choreography in Beijing, serving as the most important promoter of modern dance within the conservatory system in China. When I studied at the Academy in 2008 to 2009, Wang's classes were regularly over-enrolled, and choreographers trained in what many then called the Wang Mei style, populating nearly every major dance ensemble throughout China. Among dance scholars, Wang Mei's 2002 contemporary dance drama, Thunder and Rain, Lei He Yu, is considered one of the most canonical works of Chinese dance from this century, and it is viewed by many as a breakthrough, specifically in portrayals of women's subjectivity, sexuality, and feminist perspectives. The authors of a recent study argue that, quote, in Thunder and Rain, Wang Mei takes woman as her subject, works from a feminist viewpoint, and makes visible a complete woman's psychology. This is my translation. Thunder and Rain is an adaptation of one of China's most famous modern plays, Cao Yu's Thunderstorm from 1934, which recounts the demise of a Chinese family plagued by incest, jealousy, and an autocratic patriarch. Wang's version focuses on the story's 3 female characters, in particular the middle-aged wife, Fan Yi. In the play, Fan Yi is being slowly poisoned by her husband, who claims that it is medicine for her, quote, mental imbalance. Meanwhile, Fan Yi is also involved in a failing love affair with her husband's son from a previous marriage, Ping. Like Right and Left, Thunder and Rain uses minimalistic stage sets and everyday clothing, except in one group scene. And the movement vocabulary is a blend of vernacular movement and contemporary dance. Though Thunder and Rain makes an important contribution to feminist choreography by foregrounding female experiences and emotions, it does so in a way that unfortunately pits women against one another and portrays their agency and self-value as dependent upon heterosexual relationships with men. A sequence of interconnected duets reveals the relationships between the 3 female characters. In the first segment, Fan Yi has just been rejected by Ping and is intensely upset. She meets Su Feng, the younger woman with whom Ping is now romantically involved, and and at first, Su Feng comforts her with a moving embrace. This act of care is revealed to be insincere, however, when Su Feng suddenly pushes Fan Yi away, lets out a ridiculing laugh, and then removes her coat to taunt Fan Yi with her younger, presumably more sexually appealing body. A group of young women dressed similarly to Su Feng swarms onto the stage and chases Fan Yi across the stage, a manifestation of her inner anguish. Then an older woman, the former lover of Fan Yi's husband, appears. Like Su Feng, she laughs condescendingly, then performs a long soliloquy in which she criticizes Fan Yi for believing that she can still compete with younger women for the attention of men. Think about it. Who would want a woman like you? She asks. The key to everlasting beauty and youth, the older woman counsels, is learning to give up. If you go away now, you will remain in his heart forever, she counsels. The scene ends with the three women dancing side by side to tango music, basket in a red light with expressions of ecstasy, enjoying what appears to be a shared fantasy of everlasting appeal achieved through self-sacrifice. In Thunder and Rain, the audience gets to know Fan Yi through her violent subjugation to various male characters, and her subjectivity seems to be produced by these encounters. In one scene, she stands inclined on her tiptoes, her body making a 45-degree angle to the floor, as her husband grips her head under one arm and appears to drag her along the stage by her neck. Immediately following this, she repeatedly runs after and throws herself at her husband, grasping and clinging onto him. A similar dynamic emerges in Fan Yi's relationship to Ping, the romantic affair around which the plot largely centers, even to the extent that Fan Yi's sexual enjoyment appears to be a product of, or at least compatible with, Ping's mistreatment of her. The long duet that characterizes the pair's relationship begins with Fan Yi attempting to back away from Ping, suggesting that she does not want a romantic encounter. Ping nevertheless grabs her tightly by the wrist and does not let her go. He pulls her toward him and twists her arms around her body until she cannot move. Then Ping's manipulation of Fan Yi's body increases in intensity. He thrusts her head back and forth, grips her by the waist, and rubs his hand along her face, neck, and chest. At this point, Fan Yi's resistance fades. As Ping's hand grabs her breast, she thrusts her head back in apparent enjoyment. Then she turns and embraces Ping tenderly. So I'm going to show you this short scene. a long sequence ensues following this that seems to portray mutually consenting sexual encounter. And it ends in this pose here. Which appears to be flying on the outstretched legs of Ping and suspending in the air atop the stage. This scene suggests that Fan Yi derives extreme pleasure from her encounter with Ping, so much so that his rejection of her for a younger woman then becomes the primary defining feature of her character for the remainder of the production. While there is, of course, great variation in how women are depicted in Chinese dance, and it's impossible to generalize based on one work, I argue that the rejected heterosexual woman is an extremely common trope. Moreover, women's sexuality is often portrayed as being linked to this experience of rejection. And this produces a kind of gendered violence in which men are expected and permitted to determine women's fates, including what they can and cannot enjoy. A variety of processes lead to the maintenance of this vision in Chinese dance works. For example, a female choreographer I knew while living in Beijing, conducting fieldwork among the dance community, told me that she had entered a duet into a local dance competition, but after the first round of judging was advised to make some changes because of what was described as inappropriateness in the work's theme, which was an amicable heterosexual one-night stand. The work was changed to instead portray a man and a woman who slept together, after which the man rejected the woman and the remainder focused on the woman's sadness. This was seen as more appropriate than a couple enjoying a sexual encounter on equal and mutually unattached terms. Right and left departs from such portrayals of women on multiple levels. First, not only are men not physically present, but the relationship that develops between the two female dancers appears in no way to depend on male desire. Instead, a form of intimacy and care emerges between the two women. When the work begins, the dancers move in unison, performing a relationship of equality that lacks obvious signs of competition or self-comparison. Next, the dancers interact in a way that suggests romantic intimacy, while also maintaining parity in the relative power of each over the other. Playing with two stools, the women exchange roles, sharing weight, lowering to the floor with their bodies in parallel, and allowing their feet and legs to brush against one another. The most explicit sequence occurs when a tangled set of inversions brings Braid's face between Shorthair's thighs. Then her body is seated backwards on Shorthair's lap, legs wrapping around in a reverse embrace. They roll on the floor, their torsos pressing against one another, and their faces nearly meet. Although there is little overt sexual contact, a sense of queer intimacy develops. This happens in part from the use of the stools, which suggest a domestic space, and in part because of the haircuts, which suggest the blurring between gender sameness and gender complementarity. When the sequence described above presents an alternative to the unequal, competitive, and abusive relationships presented in Thunder and Rain, the one that immediately follows mimics these relationships in order to generate critique. The break between the two scenes is signaled by a change in music. A playful piano melody is replaced by a heavy electronic static. Shorthair turns toward the audience, staring intensely, as she slowly takes a seat on one of the stools. Throughout the next scene, she is completely passive, while Braid manipulates her body, evoking the way that Ping engaged with Fan Yi in Thunder and Rain. The difference, however, is that Shorthair does not resist. With her palm on the side of Shorthair's head, Braid gives a hard push and sends Shorthair's torso bobbing back and forth like a metronome. Then Braid rolls Shorthair's head between her hands and presses her hand alongside Shorthair's face. Shorthair's neck and arms are limp, allowing her body to flail with each push or pull. Then the flurry of motion is interrupted by a sudden stillness as Shorthair's body falls limp and motionless over the top of the stool. So I'll show this short. A direct comparison can be made between this scene and Fang Yi and Ping's duet, but the difference here is that short hair does not respond to Braid's manipulations. Through the interaction, short hair's sustained inertness acts as a foil to Fang Yi's initial resistance and then enjoyment, both of which had implied that Fang Yi's subjectivity emerged in response to or was sustained by Ping's actions. By portraying short hair as completely without subjectivity in this scene, right and left challenges the broader idea perpetuated in Thunder and Rain, namely that the woman is an equal participant in, and even complicit or welcoming of, abusive treatment by her male partner. In the next scene, Gu pushes this theme even further. Questioning whether such violent interactions are so commonplace as to engender the perception of femininity. At this point, short hair is sitting upright on a stool and facing the audience, while Braid's arm is wrapped around her neck like a stranglehold. This resembles the position in which Fang Yi's had been when her husband dragged her in Thunder and Rain. Braid's arm squeezes around short hair's face, guiding it into a forward tilt towards the audience. Short hair's eyes suddenly appear enlarged, her chin narrowed, and her face white against Braid's dark gray shirt, all while her eyes look forward and slightly upward. The position eerily resembles the familiar pose of so many cute selfies, and she suddenly appears conventionally feminine for the first time. The neck of her shirt hangs loose from the previous actions and falls to expose her shoulders and upper chest. The viewer suddenly wonders, is it the changes to her clothing and how the lighting is landing on her face that has shifted her gendered appearance? Or is it how her body is being moved? If the sequences above offer a critical intervention into Thunder and Rain's portrayal of heterosexual relationships, the following scene speaks to that among three females. Performing the alteration of one woman's appearance by another, it suggests adornment or beautification, in quotes, in the form of a gesture that could simultaneously also be read as violent. First, short hair stands caught with her arms twisted around her waist as Braid proceeds to hang the two stools from short hair's body. One from the back like a backpack and the other from the front like an oversized belt. As if short hair were a paper doll and the stools a set of pushpins, Braid presses the legs of the stools into convenient crevices, over the shoulders, under the armpits, under the crotch, around the hips. In a scene as absurd as it is poignant, Braid then guides short hair's arms to hold the two stools in place on her own body. Finally, holding onto the legs of the stools, Braid leads short hair into a series of twirls, as if the two were social dancing. Darkness slowly closes in on the stage, causing short hair's silhouette to be cast in a shadow against the back wall. With the stools hanging on her, their round tops add to curves on short hair's hips and chest, while the 8 stool legs appear in the shadow image like so many rods or spines sticking out of her torso. Finally, Braid steps away, and as if controlled by the momentum, short hair continues to twirl. When read alongside Wang Mei's Thunder and Rain, Gu Jiani's Left and Right, or Right and Left, presents a new set of possibilities for performing women in Chinese contemporary dance. On the one hand, by presenting two women in a non-antagonistic, even intimate relationship that is not mediated by male desire, Right and Left dislocates women's psychological and sexual subjectivity from its dependence upon and subordination to male desire. On the other hand, by embodying gendered violence through a female couple, in which the tomboy appears to be subjected to the manipulations and adornments of her femme partner, and made somehow strangely more feminine in the process. This invites the audience to reflect on multiple issues related to gender normativity and the ways in which women are typically portrayed in intimate relationships. In Right and Left, queer and feminist critique intersect to rethink or reperform representations of women on multiple levels. In modern Chinese performance culture, the image of the suffering woman has often been an allegory for the alienation. Yet, while women's bodies and experiences stand in for the nation metaphorically, women are rarely depicted as the primary agents of national salvation or development. With this in mind, the next section of Right and Left is interesting for the way it challenges conventional understandings of women's relationship to national culture. First, by staging these conventions, and then by undoing and complicating them. If, following the manipulation sequence discussed above, braid plays a social role marked as masculine and short hair of one marked as feminine, the next scene can be read as a clear enactment, followed by a critique of conventional ideas about the respective roles of men and women in the national political sphere. After short hair spinning is engulfed by shadow, the lights come on again to reveal Braid standing tall in front of the stage and staring directly into the audience. While short hair, the two stools still encumbering her body, stands at the back, hunched forward with her eyes cast toward her feet. As if in separate worlds, the two perform different actions simultaneously. Braid performs a manic sequence in which she repeatedly brushes the top of her head with both hands while staring into the audience, causing her hair to become increasingly disheveled. Meanwhile, short hair, still hunched over, carefully and quietly balances one stool atop the other's feet, constructing a small rectangular space between them. As Braid's head-brushing motions intensify in speed and range, short hair crouches down and shrinks her body to fit into the space between the two chairs. This scene is abstract and minimalist, and it would be a mistake to read it too literally. However, the image of short hair as woman or feminine contorting herself to fit a metaphorically domestic space, while Braid as man or masculine admonishes herself in an act that could be read as public, even intellectual self-reflection, provokes clear resonances with ongoing habits of Chinese nationalist discourse, in which gender difference is often mapped onto a constructed distinction between the private and public spheres. Evidence that this scene references the theme of the gendered nation becomes clearer as it unfolds. After short hair quietly disappears from the stage, taking the stools with her, Braid is left alone on the space of the white surface and table with which the work began. Staring into the audience, Braid takes a wide step to the side and sinks into a lowered stance, with weight distributed evenly on both feet. Her hand slowly floats to one side, and she begins a sequence of movements clearly based on the Chinese martial arts form Tai Chi. The link between this movement sequence and Chinese national and cultural identity is unmistakable. It appears in multiple forms of globalized popular culture associated with China, from martial arts films to wushu performance to a variety of contemporary dance styles that aim in different ways to embody quote-unquote Chinese culture, such as the Cloud Gate Theater of Taiwan and the Beijing Dance Academy's Chinese classical dance curriculum. As Braid performs the movement, her body shows visual marks of the relationships and experiences that have already transpired on stage over the course of the performance. Her hair is disheveled, her shirt stretched and loosened, and marks from contact with the white dusted floor still hang on her knees and shoulders. Thus, in her performance of the Tai Chi movements, Braid inserts an already established queer female subjectivity into the national or cultural imagery of China. Placing a queer female subject at the center of the national imagery is not the extent of the sequence's intervention. What happens next does something potentially even more drastic to normative discourses about how gender constructs and is constructed through national space. After performing several movements in a standard Tai Chi mode, Braid then seamlessly intertwines these actions with movements that break from it, which are unrecognizable as part of any established Chinese movement aesthetic. Allowing her hand to drop and then rise across her body like a clock hand, then arching her upper body and head back in a reverse arc, she is no longer performing Tai Chi. However, just as smoothly, she then drops back down to the low sinking stance, lowers her hands to waist level, and continues the previous sequence. With this intermingling of movement vocabulary, some marked as Chinese and some as not, Braid does more than place a new body within the existing national form. She constructs her own version of that form, thereby redefining what is meant by China through her inhabiting of it. Here, play is central to Gu's intervention. Much as the two women played with the stools as a way of rethinking sexual intimacy, in this scene, Braid plays with national form as a way of rethinking national space. When short hair rejoins Braid, performing her same movements in a different orientation, this suggests the replicability and thus inheritability of a queered national culture. Drawing on the literature of post-colonial gender and sexuality studies, cultural critic Gayatri Gopinath has argued that queer sexuality tends to be excluded from national imaginaries because it is presumed to endanger the possibility of genealogical lineage at the center of biological and patrilineal notions of national identity. Thus, when short hair doubles Braid's altered version of the national movement form, this suggests the queering of the conventional nation in at least two ways. First, it proposes a model of reproduction based on a pairing of two women, in which patrilineal relations are unnecessary and irrelevant. And second, it suggests that national culture is open to remolding and proliferation through the unrestrained bodily agency of women, something usually thought to endanger it. The entire next duet is carried out in this hybrid movement style, a kind of queer Tai Chi remix. Pulsing rhythms add syncopation to the familiar floating hands. Tilted torsos and angular arm lines break up the quintessential roundness of the conventional movements. Here, nationalized movement form is no longer a guide for how a Chinese woman should move. Instead, it becomes a resource to be mined and transformed through her productive creativity. And I'll show just a really brief clip of that. Okay, no, I won't. I already closed it out. Sorry about that. You can see it on Saturday. So, despite the fact that modern Chinese movement vocabularies like PRC Chinese classical dance were formed through processes of constant change and reformulation, many dance practitioners in China today find them highly restrictive when it comes to developing individual expressive styles. Over years of conducting ethnographic research among professional dancers in China, I found that most dancers who rejected dance styles coded as Chinese did so because of what they described as the lack of stylistic freedom these forms imposed. Gu Jiani's professional bio narrates a similar process of her own artistic development. After being trained in both ballet and Chinese classical dance, her bio states, Gu was, quote, dissatisfied with the monotony of conventional training, and she embarked on a path of meditative self-discovery, unquote. Such a story suggests, following what has become a standard narrative for modern and contemporary dancers and artists in China, that conventional movement and self-discovery are somehow mutually exclusive. Gu's creative use of movement marked as conventionally Chinese in right and left troubles this notion. By staging a reinvention and appropriation, rather than a complete rejection of conventional forms, Gu performs something similar to what Gopinath describes in her work as a queering of the nation from within, one that does not rely on a flight to an imagined elsewhere. Gopinath writes, quote, given that leaving, escaping, and traveling to a presumably freer elsewhere is not an option or even necessarily desirable for many subaltern subjects, we must take seriously the myriad strategies through which those who remain, out of choice or necessity, conspire to rework the oppressive structures in which they find themselves, unquote. In Gu's case, fleeing to an elsewhere is certainly possible. The entire rest of the production is composed using movement languages that do not use conventional Chinese movement forms. Thus, by inserting the Tai Chi movements in this sequence, Gu suggests a concerted effort to find ways of performing as a queer female within the space of the nation, rather than outside it. Like the woman in Gopinath's texts, Gu suggests through this sequence that the rejection of conventional or culturally coded spaces is not a prerequisite for queer existence or self-expression. What Gu does not engage with directly in this scene, however, is the aesthetic definition of gendered bodies that is a strong component of many Chinese coded movement forms. Chinese classical dance, one of the forms Gu studied in her conservatory training, is composed of male and female movement vocabularies that are different from one another. These movement styles grew out of the history of Chinese indigenous theater, in which male and female characters traditionally moved differently. Since cross-gender performance was a central component of Chinese indigenous theater from at least the late 18th century, gender difference became something separated from the sex of the actor, something to be created and performed through artistic skill. While this denatured the connection between gender performance and the actor's sex, it also led to a firm codification of normative gendered embodiment. As actors, until the 1920s primarily men, were trained to play characters recognizable as men or women on stage. Within the PRC Chinese classical dance curriculum, Tai Chi movement is one of the few forms conventionally performed by both men and women. In the entirety of right and left, there is no use of movements from Chinese classical dance that are coded specifically as female or male. Thus, by avoiding gender-specific movement actions in her citation of Chinese classical dance, Gu avoids engaging fully with the problem of how genderqueer expression can exist or be explored within the national form as it is defined in the PRC dance context. So, thank you very much.